Hello, fellow armchair historians. Welcome to the show. I'm Anne-Marie Cannon, your host, historical fiction author, and curious soul always chasing the human side of history. Show notes include my website, links to content discussed in the episode, how to support the show, and a free short story download that introduces readers to Bedlam from my soon-to-be-released historical fiction series. On this podcast, my guests share the history they love most, and we experience it through their eyes. What fascinates them, what they've uncovered, and why the story still matters. Let's get into it. Hello, fellow armchair historians. I'm Anne-Marie Cannon. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Khama Ennis, creator of Faces of Medicine, a documentary and podcast sharing the stories of Black women physicians in the U.S. We begin with her favorite history, Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first Black woman to earn an MD in America, graduating in 1864. And we trace how that legacy echoes into the present, especially when only 2.8% of U.S. physicians are Black women. This episode is about representation, health equity, and the power of storytelling to change what we think we know. Links to the film, podcast, and how to host a screening are in the show notes. Let's get into it. Dr. Khama Ennis, welcome to the show and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We always start out with the question, what is your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
So one of my favorite histories is that of Rebecca Lee Crumpler, Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler. I only learned about her in the last 5 or 10 years, and she was the first Black woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, and she did it in 1864.
So that was before the end of the Civil War or just at the end of it?
Just towards the end of the Civil War.
Wow.
At the time, there were, I think, 54,000. The estimates are that there were about 54,000 physicians in the country. 300 were women. And of those 300 women, up until her, none were Black. So truly a trailblazer.
I'm always inspired by that idea of somebody who maybe doesn't see themselves represented in something, and yet they're able to pursue it and do it. So you've already got me with Rebecca. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? And I think it'll start to make more sense to my listeners about where your interest maybe comes from.
Sure. So I am a physician. I finished medical school way back when in 2002. Spent most of my career in emergency medicine before switching gears, the first step of which was creating a project called Faces of Medicine, which is a documentary film and podcast featuring the stories of Black female physicians in the U.S., trying to really highlight these stories in an effort to increase representation, which is in itself an effort to improve health equity and outcomes across the board.
Like I said, I was just telling you, I just watched the documentary, which was really enlightening. It was very well done. It was very, just a lot of things that resonated with me that I'm going to probably mention during our conversation. But let's kind of go back to Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler and tell us a little bit about her. And I mean, obviously, her story is tremendous, but let's hear a little bit more about her.
Sure. She's one of the people, she's a historical figure that has been relatively little known. She started out in Delaware. I think that's where she was born. And then she was raised by an aunt in the Philadelphia area. And I believe that aunt was a nurse. And so she grew up around caregiving and healthcare and providing healthcare in a community and in her work. And then she herself became a nurse. And physicians that she worked with thought, oh my goodness, you would be an excellent physician. And I believe she was in Boston at the time. She went to the New England Female Medical College, which is now Boston University School of Medicine. And one other fun fact is that Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to earn an MD in this country, was one of her professors, one of her instructors. So she started medical school in 1860 and graduated in 1864, not without some hardships. I think, clearly if it is difficult or challenging now for people from underrepresented backgrounds to earn medical degrees, I can only imagine what she went through in her own educational journey. But then she completed her degree. She eventually became part of the Freedmen's Bureau, providing care for enslaved people who gained freedom, but without any resources after the end of the Civil War, and then came back and practiced in the Boston area. She also
Now,
wrote a book, which is kind of fascinating. I can add one other thing.
what's the book?
So oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on the title, but she wrote a book, it'll come to me, and published it in 1883, a medical discourse in two sections, I believe, something along those lines. And she essentially she took lay people through ways that they could improve their own health and well-being, particularly for women and children.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Like really accessible healthcare.
Yes.
Cool. So now you learned this after you started working on the documentary and podcast or before?
Before, just not long before, in the year or two beforehand. Yeah.
And so was that kind of like a seed, that germinated into the projects that you're working on with the Faces of Medicine documentary and podcast?
That was definitely part of it. In my own professional journey, I was honestly looking for a way to shift gears. I'd been in emergency medicine for quite some time, and for lots of different reasons, I just as an individual needed to move out of that clinical space. And I was trying to figure out how to do that. When you go through med school and residency, you are very much indoctrinated in this is the one thing that you can do. So it took a little doing to expand my own horizons of my own capabilities in that way. And so in my desire to switch gears, I thought, and I learned about her story, I said, well, maybe what I could do is tell my story and share my story with others. And that can be a light for people who want to go into medicine but don't see themselves in those spaces. And then I thought, well, that's one version and one very specific history. What about collecting multiple histories and multiple stories from as many perspectives as I can to really share these stories both with people, young Black girls and women who have never seen themselves in the space, think that because of what they've been through or what their own personal life experience is, that it's not for them. And show themselves in all of these stories. And that's my hope. So yeah, her story was definitely part of the seed.
And I will say that the women that you interviewed, especially Dr. Thea James, I wish that I could bottle her sayings and her wisdom, but we'll get to that. They are part of that history. So at first I was like, this is a pretty contemporary story. But then as I listened to the documentary and the experiences of the women, it was really clear to me that this is, the ongoing history of Dr. Rebecca, I keep forgetting her name, Crumpler. And so it seems like from listening to you talk, it just kind of evolved into this thing that was just waiting to be found and completed. Like all the pieces were there and you found the pieces. And that seems to have been your creative process. It's like you had all that experience yourself as far as being a doctor, being a woman of color, being one of the statistics that really stood out to me is that only 2% of doctors, is it in the United States or in the world, are Black females.
Yeah. 2.8% of U.S. physicians are Black women. That's it.
Did you know that before you started doing the research?
No. I mean, you know it somewhat instinctively, but I didn't. I think because none of us wants to be in that position, right? Like it doesn't feel good to be an underrepresented person in a space. And it can be hard to just sort of take it, absorb that information and then figure out what to do with it. So I did the research on Rebecca Lee Crumpler and thought, how come how come I was in my 40s and so far out of medical school before I'd even heard her name?
Well, I just heard her name really in the past 2 weeks since I
Yeah.
was researching this. And it's like very powerful voice, and the story needs to be told. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that part of my own background is that my undergrad focus was medical anthropology. So stories and storytelling and the ways that people see themselves and illness and wellness and in all of these contexts has always been a part of how I look at my career in medicine and in this way and how I look at public health as well. And really trying to sort out ways to improve overall public health. And, these are the challenges of healthcare disparities are systemic problems. And this lack of representation and lack of reflection of the communities that we serve is absolutely part of that puzzle.
So let's go back to you becoming a doctor. And like, when did you decide you were going to do that? Was there somebody in your family that was a physician? Tell us
So,
about it.
yeah, I was very young and in the very concrete thought process of an elementary school child. So there's some, it's not all roses. So I was probably 7 or 8 years old. I was in an elementary school where the first couple of years went as sweetly as any other elementary school. And then a couple of grades in, it got a little murky and there was hostility. And I had some teachers that I could, you can just feel they did not like me. And I was getting notes home that I was a bad and disruptive kid. And I'm Jamaican, and getting a note sent home that you were a bad and disruptive kid does not come without consequences in most Caribbean households. And so that had a very big impact. And eventually, one of my kindergarten teacher and my parents got together and said, "There's something is not adding up," and pushed the school to test me because said maybe she's just bored. If you give her more work, maybe she'll stop talking. So my sister and I actually were in the similar situations. And so they did whatever the tests were to see if we just needed more work. And I did well in the tests. And similar to Dr. Stone in the film, they didn't believe my score, retested me without my parents' consent. And I did better. And at that point, I was put into sort of an advanced academic track. And so, based on that, and in the very binary thinking of a child, I said, well, smart people are doctors or lawyers. So, which one am I going to be? I guess I should be a doctor because they just help people. And lawyers, sometimes they have to figure out if you're good or bad or how to go about
Wow.
things. If I'm a doctor, all I have to do is help. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I honestly locked in at a really young age. And that was the common thread for every decision I made after that.
So, how old were you when you locked into that?
Like 7 or 8 years old.
And look at you now.
Little kid.
That's amazing. I still don't know what I want to do, so I'm impressed.
Well, it's just part of the picture.
Yeah, wow. Well, and there was something about the women that you interviewed is it seemed like there was this determination, there was blinders, nothing would stop them from getting to the point that they got to. The other thing I noticed about some of the women, which I'm going to have you talk about in a minute, is that none of them just do one thing. I'm on the board of this and I do that and I do. And it's like, wow, I'm exhausted just hearing you tick off that list of things that you're doing. So these are very driven people that I think should be commended just for the fact that they persevered through, what they had to go through as Black children and women to get to the point that they are now. So why don't you tell me about how you went about deciding who to interview and what to include in the documentary?
Sure. So the process of gathering folks who were willing to share their stories and honestly willing to share them with a candor that I did not anticipate. So one of the first people I reached out to was Dr. Thea James. And that was because when I was in my third or fourth year of med school, she was the attending physician when I was doing a rotation in a Boston emergency department. And I was in awe. Like I was just completely awestruck. She had a kindness and and intelligence and the command of a space and a patient-centered focus that it blew me away. And I had kept her contact information and transferred it from paper phone book to eventually a cell phone to whatever it was. The number was no longer correct, but I never forgot her name and reached out to her. And she, almost without hesitation, said that she would participate, which again blew me away. Dr. Watkins had just come in as the new CEO of the hospital that I was working at the time. And I had met her once or twice during her interview process and thought, well, she could say no if she wants to, but I don't have anybody else who's had that, to that extent, a leadership role. And I would love to tell that perspective if she was willing to share. Other folks came to me through word of mouth. Valerie Stone was suggested by a colleague who said, this is a person in the Boston area who's just incredible. And then Dr. Cesar was suggested by someone locally, because I also wanted to show not just, like people with crazy titles. I want to see people who are in communities, in rural communities, in all parts of where we live. And so the documentary has folks who are primarily in Massachusetts. The podcast expands and includes people from all different parts of the country, because I didn't ever want a kid in Wisconsin to say, sure, that's a nice story, but that doesn't happen here.
So is the podcast ongoing? Is there going to be a season 3?
There will be a season 3. That might be the final season. So where my initial vision, if I'm quite honest, was a 3 or 4 part documentary series with all of the stories to be told in that way. So we've recorded a number of interviews, but budgets, fundraising, current socio-political environment have rendered some of that not feasible at this point. So I wanted to still get the stories out because the stories are incredible. And they're very diverse as well. We all share the commonality of being Black women, but we are far from a monolith. And so the podcast we're in the midst of our 2nd season right now, and there'll be a 3rd season coming out late spring, early summer.
And that also is called Faces of Medicine?
Faces of Medicine, and it's available on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, anywhere people get podcasts. You should be able to find it.
Well, I guess I don't need to ask you why this history. I think you've made that pretty clear. But why this project? Like, how did you end up saying, oh, I'm going to do a documentary? And it's obviously you have a team of people who have produced this. And so how did you go about that process of figuring out how to put this documentary together?
So one of the things about emergency physicians is that we will figure out how to MacGyver just about anything.
Okay.
There was the seed of the idea. I woke up one day and I said, oh, I know what I have to do. I have to collect stories. I've been struggling with my own professional transition, and what do I do? And I thought, I'll collect these stories. I'll put them in an anthology. I'll write a book, and it'll be pretty simple, collect stories, do some editing. I know how to write, and then I'll put that out, and that'll be great. And I was talking with a friend, one of my cousins actually, about it, and because she'd gone to film school. And I said, can you give me some advice on cheap camera equipment? I don't have any money to do this, so I'm going to just try to get something that gives me decent recordings. And she said, well, how about I help you? And it turns out that she, at the time, had been working with an independent, had a side project of doing some production work. And so I said, okay, but I have no money. And so my partner has been an artist for many years and said, well, what you do is you get fiscal sponsorship and then you ask people. And I said, I don't ask people for help. He said, you're going to ask people now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And
going outside your comfort zone.
That was one of the most stressful emails I've ever sent out. I had to push send twice, and I had to have a little sip of something as well. But so I, went through the process of getting fiscal sponsorship so that anybody who donates to support the project through Fractured Atlas can get a tax donation or tax deduction and all that. And so I reached out to everyone I know and I said, I'm doing this project. If you want to support it, that's wonderful. If you don't completely understand. And people started to support the work. And so then I thought, oh my goodness, I have to do this. And honestly, the first donation came in and that was it. And so my partner stepped in to work as the project manager. My cousin stepped in and on the production side of things, she helped source local crews to wherever the interviews were taking place because I wanted to minimize the disruption and the extra labor that these women were putting forward, knowing that they're already, as you mentioned, so busy doing so many things. And so my goal was to make it as simple and as easy as possible. So if somebody wanted the interview to be in their home, it was in their home. If they wanted their office, it was in their office. If they wanted neither, I would rent a space. All they had to do was show up for their period of time and then leave and just really keep any efforts that they had at a minimum, aside from approving the material that we use, because that was also very important to me to make sure that people felt comfortable with how they were being represented, both in the film and in the podcast. So every step of the way, we'll get a certain amount of work done, and then I'll run it by them for approval to make sure that we're okay to move to the next stage. So yeah, that was kind of it. And so then we got a consulting producer, a wonderful man named Monty Ross, who has been in the industry for quite some time, and he helped out with some hints. And I learned how to write a script, and a lot of it was learning on the fly how to put together a project like this.
What I liked about it is that it was accessible, the way that the script was written, the information that was put out there, which, like I said, that's what I try to do with my podcast. I try to make people think about history. I try to make it accessible. And the best way to do that is through people's passion. And that was one of the things that it was succinct. I like that about it. So you talked about racial bias and systemic racism in the documentary. And the way that I think it came out is by everybody kind of exchanging notes about what it was like for them to be a doctor. It seemed to be a common thread that wasn't like explicitly stated by anybody, but it was the stories and the experiences. And can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Happy to. So I think that when you're in a female body in male dominated spaces, when you're in a female body of color in other spaces, there are so many experiences that we have that we just don't talk about. Our focus is the work. If we're in healthcare, our focus is the patient that's in front of us. And so you go through it, but you don't really dwell on it because we're just trying to get through the day and take care of the patients because that's our actual job. And this was an opportunity in doing these interviews. I think most people have never really been asked and given the space to share what their experiences have been. And so, and I didn't want it to only be about, the hardships and the challenges. I wanted it to be about the joys and triumphs and who helped, each of us along the way, because it's not all negative. I think there is a balance there. And honestly, I think given some of the current sociopolitical circumstances, when histories are erased, we erase the good with the bad. We erase the allies that come through in the midst of other challengers and episodes of racism or bias that could otherwise throw someone off course. I think we've all had experiences. I remember after a certain number of times of being asked how old I was or where I went to school or, and at that point in my career, I was, over 10 years out. I'm in my 40s. I don't look like a kid anymore. Like I'm not. I would love to think that I look like I'm 23, but I don't. Right? And I went in to talk with some of my colleagues and I said, does anyone ever ask you where you went to school? And they all said, no, why would they ask that? And I'm like, that's a question that I'm asked with pretty consistently. Like if not every couple of weeks, it's a regular question. And I think that was also part of the seed for this film, was just realizing that these are experiences that are set in bias, not necessarily always malignant. It's there and it happens, and there is a cumulative impact, and there's an impact on patients when these interactions happen, and that affects our longevity as physicians, because eventually people get burnt out, and anybody who's in
Hmm.
healthcare and medicine can get burnt out. But I think when there's additional burdens placed on an individual that just make it harder and harder to go to work every single day, that 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 excess burden is real. And if we leave, the impact is beyond just losing another physician. It's losing a person that has a real measurable impact on improving outcomes and health equity. And so part of sharing the stories was it was to get people into the space, but also to make it clearer to everybody, right? Because I think
Hmm.
that people don't necessarily intend to cause harm with questions, or they're not necessarily conscious of when they're acting out systemic racism that's just in the water. And so it just brings it to light, hopefully
Hmm.
destigmatizes it so that conversations can be had and we can figure out how to get better together. How do you improve the situation together?
I like the way that you put that it's in the water. And one of the things that was included in the documentary, which I really appreciated, was, and I can't remember which physician it was, but they told the story of the white woman who came for an appointment and didn't realize that their physician was a Black woman. And in the reception area, she was saying, I don't know if I can go through with this. I have never, been seen by a Black person or whatever. And well, maybe you can finish the story. I really love this
Yeah.
story because I feel like it kind of moves from that racism, systemic racism, it exists. And then this is one of those stories that, kind of shows us moving through that and what that looks like. So I don't know, maybe you can finish the story.
Sure. So I will do my best to do her justice, but
Mhm.
Dr. Rose Cesar tells it so well. So she is a gastroenterologist in a rural area and had a patient come to see her and had that reaction, as you stated, like, I've never seen a doctor. I've never seen a Black doctor before. I don't know if I can have this. And the Dr. Cesar's nurse or receptionist said, well, you can leave. And but the patient decided to stay, didn't say anything to Dr. Cesar at the time, went through the entire interaction, and by the end of it was, I think, so taken by her care, the care that she had received, that she said, is it okay if I give you a hug?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so she did. And my reaction and her final response was, like, sometimes this is some work that we have to do just to build those bridges. And I said, yeah, but that's also unpaid labor. Her job was to be a gastroenterologist and
Right.
take care
Yeah.
of people's digestive tracts. And she
Right.
said, you know what? But sometimes it's just part of the job. And I think her grace for that patient in that moment, her staff members caring for her well
Hmm.
being, to be able to say, like, I'm going to maybe see if I can shield this person from you.
Yeah.
Um, or shield you from this person, but having the entire interaction go so beautifully in the end, that patient now has had a moment where they've got a different image, maybe. And given where in this rural area, it is very possible to live much of your life without interacting with people of color. And
Right.
so that patient may not have had any interactions with people of color over many, many weeks or months or years. And so, but that creates a bridge. And that's part of the work that we're trying to do as well.
Well, and I think the other thing is that, and I hope my notes are good to get on to this next part, but it's this idea of having respect and listening and people feeling heard. And I think maybe that was this woman's experience. Like maybe she had always seen a certain type of doctor.
Mhm.
And maybe she felt really, I mean, we don't know, but this is what I was thinking. And maybe she really felt heard in a way, that she felt compelled to want to embrace this woman, this doctor. I don't know. And that was something that also was talked about a lot. And I felt that there was a lot of just this sense of, it's not all science and medical. There's another part to what we do, and that is to listen to people and to believe people. And can I tell you how many times I have felt not believed by a doctor? So many times. But I think that is the other part, the other thing that came across in these particular people that you interviewed for the podcast. And so, two things that I wrote down quotes from Dr. Thea James is, it doesn't help to fill the gaps, you have to eliminate them. And I'm curious about that and what that meant to you, and how do we as a society do that? How do we as individuals do that?
I love Dr. Thea James.
So do I.
So I think, I think what she means there is that she's really speaking to like systemic solutions for systemic problems. So we all have bias. I have bias. I know that my friends do. I know that my colleagues do. And it's not a realistic goal for any of us to be completely free of bias. What we do need to do, however, is to create a system where whatever biases we have no opportunity to cause patient harm, and where there's an opportunity to also reflect and address that and acknowledge it so that we can minimize any harm done to patients. So there's individual bias that we may have, like you walk into a patient room and think that because of how they're dressed or how they speak, or if they smell like cigarette smoke or whatever it is, that assumptions are made. And I think if we just sort of acknowledge, I'm making an assumption here, I'm going to listen to the patient and what they have to say without those assumptions, without the conclusions that my lizard brain has leapt to, and treat the patient that's in front of me and listen to what they're saying. So I think that's part of it. And there's also the system, the part of systemic gaps that we can address there's baked in bias and racism in medicine in algorithms, like truly algorithms that we follow. There was a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine several years ago that examined a number of algorithms that are used for anything for how to address urinary tract infections in children or how to approach kidney disease. The kidney disease one is, I think, particularly valid. And so there had been in many systems a correction factor that was built into a lab test result. So completely, like you send a blood sample to a lab, the lab gets the number that looks at, and that number is used to calculate essentially how well or poorly the kidneys are functioning. And there had been, and still is in many systems, a correction factor that was included for Black people that said, if this number, let's say, is 1, for a Black person, we're going to say it's actually better than that. It's 0.8, because Black folks function better at a number that would otherwise be considered reflective of poor kidney function. And so that correction factor ends up delaying care for kidney disease. It ends up delaying being put on transplant lists. It delays and harms people. It delays care and harms people. And there are lots of systems that have gone through and said, oh my gosh, we've got this in our lab, and eliminated it. Every system needs to do that. Every system needs to go and examine that baked in correction. There are algorithms for how to proceed with when to get a C-section, when to start a C-section for a patient, based on what their vital signs are, what their history is. And many of the algorithms will place Black women in the position of being more likely to get C-sections. And with C-sections, which are major operations, there is a risk of surgical complications. There's more time out of work. There's a lot of fallout that comes as a result of an algorithm. So doctors are following what they're supposed to be doing. And so eliminating things like that, I think, is part of eliminating those gaps. Ensuring ways that highly qualified people have as much of an opportunity to go to medical school as anyone else, taking into account differences in background, but knowing that the skills and intelligence are there for people of all backgrounds, and that we do have a duty to reflect the communities that we serve, knowing that there's a real impact.
And then the other thing she said was always reach back and pull forward. That was the other thing that stuck out to me. And what you're doing, that's what I see you doing. You know, you're representing your little girl can look at you and say what Rebecca didn't have, Crumpler didn't have, was seeing a doctor that looked like her. And you are, but you, for some little girl, you're doing that through this endeavor that you're doing. And so that's what I was thinking when she said that. I was thinking about you and what you're doing and how this is that basically, that idea basically in action. What haven't I asked you that you do want my listeners to kind of walk away knowing about this history?
So I think that one of the things that is incredibly important, that's probably already natural for your listeners, is to be curious about what we have learned, what we haven't learned, to be curious about histories that are highlighted and be just as curious about the histories that are hidden, to think about these histories from multiple perspectives. I think that one of the other aspects of Rebecca Lee Crumpler's history, in addition to the fact that there's clearly no way that she could have gotten to where not that she didn't have the ability and aptitude, but in the system and the culture that existed in 1860, there is no way that she could have started medical school without the support of white people who were helping her along. And I think I haven't been able to confirm because there's not a lot of detail, but one of the things that I believe I learned was that an Ohio abolitionist named Benjamin Wade paid for her medical education. So that's how it was funded. So when we lose the history of her existing and that gets buried, we lose the history of the allies and people who helped to support that as well. And I think without that being known, we forget that it is incredibly important that we help each other in these times and in all times, because that is how we actually improve life So I think be curious, learn more, dig deeper, and think about whether or not you've ever seen a Black female physician in your life or when the first time was that it happened. Think about whether there were any colleagues in her circle. Think about maybe what the conversation was that you had with her at the time and whether there were any things that maybe you would have done differently based on what you know now. And please do listen to the stories, listen to the podcast, watch the documentary. None of this, I think we get so politicized and things are about blame, and none of these stories are about blame. These are all sharing stories in a way that I hope cuts through defenses and just goes to the heart of things and shows all of our collective humanity. So
Beautiful. That's beautiful. Reminds me of Bad Bunny. I don't know if you saw his Grammy speech. It was like, oh, I just want to be pissed off all the time. I'll cut this out. I just want to be pissed off all the time because there's something about that's like self-righteous anger. But he's like, we're not savages, we, love is what is going to transcend everything. So that was beautiful. Thank you for saying that and sharing that. There was something else I wanted to ask you. What was the thing that you were most surprised about that you thought you kind of knew, but then when you went in and you did this project, what was the thing that surprised you the most?
I think how different all the stories were. I am an N of one. I know my story. My sister happens to be a physician as well. I know her story. I know the stories of some close friends, but I've learned just as much about the different paths as anyone else who has listened or seen the film. I There's a person who's going to be in the podcast who's a third generation physician. I didn't even think the math could work that way. I didn't think the generational math of years could work the way to have a situation where a third generation physician is here right now. So, and personally, I was part of what was going on at the time that I started that project was that I was planning to leave clinical medicine. I was done. I said, I just finished paying back my school loans. I was officially free to move forward with a different life. And quite honestly, hearing the stories, giving myself the time to breathe, created the space that has actually allowed me to come back to clinical medicine and allowed me to explore it in different ways. And so for me as an individual, that has
Wow.
been incredibly rewarding. I learned other types of medicine and I'm practicing in a different space than I would have ever imagined. And I feel very grateful for the stories and the journeys that were shared. And I was quite honestly shocked sometimes about how honest people were. Because I think a lot of times, myself included, we hold back stories. We don't talk about the harder things. We just want to sort of gloss things over and say, like, nope, we're good. It's all fine. I'm going to handle my business. I took care of it. Moving on. And people were vulnerable and honest and transparent
Honest,
in a
yeah.
way that I think is going to help so many people. And have been deeply grateful for that.
Yeah, I would say that it was emotionally relatable no matter who you are
Yeah.
because of the honesty. Anything else? Anything else before I ask where we can find you and thank you for being here?
Thank you. I've never been good at asking for help, as I mentioned when I first sent the email. But I'll say that our current plan is to complete season 2 and season 3. If there is enough interest in the world for us to go on to season 4 or anything beyond, and anybody wants to support that, Fractured Atlas is our fiscal sponsor, and facesofmedicine.org is where people can find more information about the project, how to donate if anyone would choose to, and also links to both film, the documentary. One other thing is, if folks listening would like to host a screening, we do screenings through our partner called Kinema. It's an independent film house essentially, and people can either watch it themselves for a very small fee or hold screenings for an organization or school. I would love to have it screened in various schools, community organizations, and really just share the stories and hopefully soften some hearts and move some minds.
Great. Thank you. So I think you told us where we can find you at the website and everything kind of flows out from there.
Yeah.
Dr. Ennis, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your interest. And I'm excited for this.
Me too. I'm going to press. What I'm carrying with me from this conversation is a reminder to stay curious about the histories we're taught and just as curious about the ones we aren't. Because when stories like Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler's get buried, we don't just lose a name. We lose the fuel. We don't just lose a name. We lose the full human chain behind it. The courage, the labor, the joy, the cost, and even the allies who helped make that path possible. If this episode moved you, I really encourage you to explore Faces of Medicine. You'll find links in the show notes to the documentary, the podcast, and ways to support the project, plus information on how to host a screening through Kinema. And if you're still here with me, let this be your small invitation. Think back. When was the first time you were treated by a Black woman physician? Or have you ever been? What would it mean if every child could answer that question early, naturally, and without it being a first? As always, thank you for listening, for sharing the show, and for helping these histories travel. Until next time, be curious, be kind, and keep chasing the human side of history. Thanks for spending time with me on Armchair Historians. If you enjoyed this episode, the easiest way to support the show is to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you can, leave a rating or review. or share the episode with a friend who loves history. You'll find my website and links to everything we discussed in the show notes, along with ways to support the show more directly, whether that's joining the community, supporting financially, or simply helping more listeners to discover the podcast. And don't forget, the show notes also include a free short story download that introduces readers to Bedlam from my soon-to-be-released historical fiction series. Until next time, keep asking questions because history is anything but finished.